It wasn't the usual oily mechanical slide of a well-worn deadbolt that had greeted me every evening for 24 years. While the porch light overhead flickered with the same dying buzz it had since I was 10, but the lock was fresh, the brass was too shiny, the cylinder too tight. I didn't knock. I knew that silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of two people sitting just behind the door. It was on, but the house felt dead. For 3 years, I had been the problem. Not because I drank, or stayed out late, or failed to contribute. No, I was the problem because I was the only person in that house who could read a balance sheet. I was the one who noticed that my father's international investments were actually just wire transfers to a high-yield savings account in the name of a woman he deemed on a forum for vintage watch collectors. I was the one who saw the second mortgage my mother took out to fund a boutique that sold nothing but overpriced driftwood and NLM candles. I was the golden child turned jailer because I tried to save them from themselves. And today, apparently, the jailer had been evicted. I walked back to my car, the cold evening air stinging my lungs. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the siding. I just sat in the driver's seat of my Honda and looked at the manila envelope sitting on the passenger side. The sheriff's papers. They thought they were locking me out of a house. They didn't realize they were locking themselves into a tomb. The house of paper-thin walls, my parents, Arthur and Elaine, were masters of what I called the middle-class mirage. They lived in a 4-bedroom colonial they couldn't afford, drove leased SUVs that smelled like vanilla and desperation, and treated every Sunday dinner like a Broadway opening night. When I finished my CPA exam and moved back home to help them reorganize, I thought I was being the dutiful son. I thought if I consolidated their debt, managed their utilities, and put them on a strict allowance, we could keep the ship upright. I was young enough to believe that logic could cure entitlement. Sipping wine that cost $40 a bottle while the electric bill sat overdue on the granite counter. It's just money. We're family. Family doesn't count pennies. It's not just money, Mom, I'd say. My voice tight with the kind of exhaustion that ages a man in his 20s is the fact that the bank is sending notice to cure letters every 3 weeks. It is the fact that Dad is investing in a woman in Prague who doesn't exist. The breaking point happened a month ago. I found out they had used my social security number stolen from my tax returns and my own desk to co-sign a predatory loan for a backyard renovation. It was a massive stamped concrete patio. They used exactly twice to host people they didn't even like. I didn't yell. I didn't call the police, not then. I simply told them that if they didn't sign over a limited power of attorney so I could liquidate the unnecessary assets and save the house from the impending foreclosure they hidden from me, I was done. They smiled. They hugged me. They said they understood. They called me their savior. And then, while I was at my firm finishing a grueling tax audit for a high-priority client, they went to the hardware store. They changed the locks. They packed my clothes into trash bags and threw them into the oily puddles of the garage. They chose the mirage over the sun. The cold dish. The sheets smelled like lemon bleach and old cigarettes. I spent the night staring at the popcorn ceiling, looking at the legal filings I had prepared weeks ago as a worst-case scenario. Or you report the fraud. If you report the fraud, the loan is voided for you. But the bank, a cold, unfeeling entity with a legal department the size of a small city, goes after the perpetrators with the fury of 1,000 suns. I had tried to do it the family way. I had offered to pay the loan off if they gave me control. They assumed I was too loyal to fight back. They banked on my guilt. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I drove to the county courthouse. The sheriff's papers weren't an eviction notice for me. I didn't need one. I was already gone. They were a formal notice of fraudulent activity and a summons for a civil asset seizure because I wasn't just their son. Over the last 3 years, I had funneled $85,000 of my own hard-earned savings into loans to them to keep the mortgage afloat. I had documented every single cent. I had promissory notes signed by both of them during their moments of clarity when they needed cash fast. I had been their bank, and like any bank, I had a lien on the property. I wasn't just leaving, I was foreclosing. The day the music died 6 days later, I returned. This time, I didn't use a key. I didn't need one. I arrived at 10 the time. I knew my mother would be having her second coffee, and my father would be browsing luxury watch auctions he couldn't afford. I arrived with 2 men in brown uniforms and a court-appointed appraiser. I saw my mother through the front window, looking out at the street with that practiced, serene smile she used to signal to the neighbors that everything was perfect. When she saw the sheriff's cruiser, her face didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The teacup didn't just slip. It seemed to shatter in her hand before it even hit the hardwood floor. I stood on the porch. The sheriff didn't ring the bell. He knocked. It was a heavy, authoritative sound that echoed through the hollow house. "We told you your things are in the garage. We've moved on as a family unit. We need our space to heal." The sheriff didn't wait for the monologue. He stepped into the foyer, his boots loud on the polished wood. He handed my father the packet, plus interest and concurrent investigation into identity theft and credit fraud filed by the plaintiff, Leo Miller. The silence that followed was different from the one behind the locked door. This silence was hollow. It was the sound of a vacuum. You're suing us. My mother whispered, appearing behind my father. Her face was pale, the mirage finally evaporating into the cold morning air. "Leo, we're your parents. We gave you life. We gave you this home. You gave me a bill," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the anger I thought I'd feel. "And then you gave me a lock. I didn't sue you because I wanted to. I sued you because I refused to be the collateral damage for your fantasies. We were going to pay you back." My father shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He tried to puff out his chest, the old patriarch routine, but it fell flat in the face of the sheriff's badge. "With what, Dad? The watch money? You have 0 liquid assets and 3 defaulted credit cards I found in the mail last week. You didn't even pay the water bill this month." The sheriff stepped forward, signaling the appraiser to begin. "Move aside, sir. We are here to inventory the home's contents. Anything not deemed an essential life support item is subject to valuation for the satisfaction of the debt." The sickness sets in. They sat on the stairs, the very stairs where they used to take photos of me before prom, while the men moved through the house with clipboards. It's a strange, visceral thing, watching your life be itemized by strangers. 165-inch old TV, $1,200. 1 set of sterling silver flatware, unopened. Bought on credit, $3,000. 1 vintage Rolex, found hidden in a sock drawer. The very one my father claimed he'd sold to pay the taxes, $12,000. My mother began to hyperventilate. It wasn't a panic attack in the medical sense, not exactly. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated shame. She realized that by tomorrow, the neighbors would see the truck. They would know that the Millers weren't old money or successful consultants. They were frauds. "I feel sick," she moaned, clutching her stomach, rocking back and forth on the 3rd step. "Arthur, I'm going to be sick. Tell them to stop." "Leo, tell them to stop?" "It's the stress," my father snapped, though his own hands were shaking so hard he couldn't hold the legal papers. He looked at the sheet detailing the identity theft charges, the felony-level charges. "Leo, this is jail time. You're putting your father in jail. For a patio? For a little help?" "No," I said, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen I used to scrub every Sunday while they went to brunch. "The state is putting you in jail. I am just providing the evidence you created when you forged my signature on a $40,000 high-interest loan." You used my life as collateral for your ego? Did you think I'd just work for the next 10 years to pay off your backyard? The sickness they felt wasn't a virus. It was the sudden, crushing weight of reality. For 20 years, they had lived in a world where consequences were things that happened to other people. People who weren't good families. They had spent 2 decades floating on a cloud of credit and lies, and I had just shot the cloud out from under them. As the movers took the designer sofa, the one they bought with the money meant for the property taxes, my father looked at me with a look I will never forget. It wasn't regret. It was genuine, concentrated hatred. "You're no son of mine," he hissed. "You're a parasite. Taking from your own parents." I am the only one in this room who hasn't taken a dime that didn't belong to them, I replied. "A son is someone you protect, Dad. I was just your ATM, and the ATM is out of service. Permanent technical difficulties. The liquidation of a life, the process was clinical. The appraiser noted the Persian rugs, the high-end kitchen appliances, and the artwork that my mother had insisted was an investment, but turned out to be mass-produced prints in expensive frames. Every time a piece of furniture left the house, my mother let out a small, jagged sob. It was as if her identity was being stripped away layer by layer. Without the stuff, who was she? Without the house, who was Arthur? They weren't people. They were a collection of things they didn't own. By 4 p.m., the house was a skeleton. The echoes were loud, bouncing off the walls that had once been filled with the sounds of fake laughter and expensive wine. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the pale rectangles on the wallpaper where the paintings used to hang. The sheriff approached me. "We've secured the high-value items for auction. The fraud department will be in touch regarding the criminal filing. You have the keys to the property back, as you are the primary lien holder and the court has granted you temporary possession pending the sale." I looked at the keys in his hand. They were the keys to the new lock. My parents were still sitting on the stairs, looking like 2 children who had been left behind at a department store. "You have 24 hours to vacate," I told them. My voice didn't shake. "I've rented a small apartment for you. 2 bedrooms, clean, safe. The first 3 months are paid for out of the remaining equity I am allowing you to keep. It's more than you gave me. A 2-bedroom? My mother whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "In that part of town. It's a roof, Mom, which is more than I had when I got home from work and found the locks changed." The aftermath, I didn't stay to watch them pack. I couldn't. I went back to my motel room and slept for 14 hours. It was the first time in 3 years I hadn't woken up in a cold sweat, wondering if the bank was going to seize my car, or if my parents had opened another line of credit in my name. The fallout was spectacular. The identity theft charges were eventually reduced to a massive fine and 5 years of probation, mostly because I refused to testify in exchange for them signing over the deed to the house entirely. I didn't want them in a cell. I wanted them out of my financial life. I sold the house 3 weeks later. I didn't even fix the dying porch light. The sale covered my $85,000, paid off the fraudulent loan, and left me with a modest nest egg. My parents moved into the shameful apartment. They didn't call to thank me for the 3 months of rent. They didn't call at all, except for one voicemail from my father 3 months later, asking if I knew where he'd put his cufflinks. I didn't answer. I moved to a different city. I started a new job at a firm where nobody knew me as the guy whose parents robbed him. I met a girl who grew up in a house where they bought what they could afford and fixed what was broken. One evening, about a year later, I found myself driving through my old neighborhood. I shouldn't have, but I wanted to see it. The new owners had painted the shutters a bright, welcoming blue. They had a swing set in the front yard. There were no ghosts of unpaid bills or whispered lies in the windows. It looked like a real home, not a stage set. I felt a pang of sadness, sure. You can't excise 24 years of your life without a little scarring. You can't look at the people who raised you and see only creditors without losing a piece of your soul. But then I remembered the sound of that plastic lock clicking shut while I stood in the dark. I remembered the feeling of being discarded like a piece of trash after I had given them everything I had. I reached into my pocket and felt my new keys. They turned smoothly in the ignition of a car I owned outright. I drove away, leaving the Mirage behind for good. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about making them suffer. It was about making them live the life they had actually earned. And as for me, I had finally unlocked the door to my own life. The air outside was cold, but for the first time in years, I was finally warm. I turned on the radio, rolled down the windows, and drove toward a future that didn't require a signature from anyone but me. I was no longer the keeper of their secrets. I was just Leo, and that was more than enough. The cycle of the middle-class mirage had ended with me. I would never own a house I couldn't afford. I would never buy a gift with stolen money. I would never lock my child out because they saw the truth. I looked in the rearview mirror as the old neighborhood faded. I wasn't looking back. I was just making sure the road was clear. It was